Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
We hear about crimes and murders every day. The wife that found out her husband was having an affair and she shot him. The driver that got robbed making a delivery in a neighborhood known for shady activity. The man that let his anger get the best of him and pulled someone out of their car in a fit of road rage after they cut him off. Every incident, while terrible, both plays on our fears and gives us a false sense of security. We know what to expect in those situations. The who, what, when, where, and why. They can all be answered. But what about when the why was simply to create chaos? What about when the who, what, when, and where didn't make any difference? More than likely, you've watched the Batman movies. The Caped Crusader that was able to solve every crime and figure out the riddles. His mental capabilities even exceeded his physical strength. But even he met a criminal he just couldn't make sense of in the movie The Dark Knight. Alfred, who always seemed to know the right thing to say no matter the circumstances, made an observation. While bone-chilling, it's true. He said, "Some men just want to watch the world burn." 4 decades ago, Chicago was rocked by seemingly senseless crimes. The Chicago Tylenol Murders took place in 1982. 7 people died in the area as a result of Tylenol Extra Strength gelatin capsules being laced with potassium cyanide. The first death reported was a 12-year-old girl. Her parents gave her Tylenol because she had a sore throat, which is what most parents would do. She was dead by the next morning. Of course, no one knew the cause of death in that moment. Luckily, no one else in her house took the Tylenol before the paramedics got there and bagged it up. But not every family was that fortunate. A 27-year-old postal worker took Tylenol at home, and initially his death was thought to be a heart attack. His brother and sister-in-law were distraught. They rushed over to the house upon hearing the news, and that day's events had their heads throbbing. The stress of it caused them to have headaches. So they did what any of us would do. They took Tylenol. They both died. Arlington Heights' only public health official was sent to the crime scene to look around. She found the bottle on the counter and counted the capsules. There were 44. 6 had been taken, probably 2 by each of the 3 victims in that house. The bottle made its way to the deputy chief medical examiner. He immediately noticed that it had an almond-like scent, common with cyanide. He asked the chief toxicologist to test the capsules. All 44 capsules tested contained fatal amounts of cyanide. Every single capsule in that bottle was potentially fatal. Police watched the graves and the funerals in hopes that whoever committed the crime would show up at one of the scenes, but no one that raised red flags did. The bottles purchased could not even be linked to a single store. The contaminated bottles had been bought from different businesses. Originally, they thought the bottles were all from the same lot, but soon they realized that there were multiple lots involved. A recall was issued on every bottle of Tylenol Extra Strength gelatin capsules in the Chicago area. It was one of the largest pharmaceutical recalls at the time. Johnson & Johnson, Tylenol's manufacturer, warned hospitals and distributors of the evolving crisis. They even stopped production of the product until more was learned. Then a new case popped up in California. That was a long way from the cases they thought were contained to Chicago. This time, the Tylenol had strychnine in it. Johnson & Johnson made the decision to recall the product nationwide on October 5, 1982. An estimated 31 million bottles were in circulation at the time. The cost of the product recall was over $100 million, equivalent to well over $300 million today. They even did some advertising to discourage people from consuming the product while the source of the poison was being investigated. Market shares collapsed. The list of side effects and warnings on most medications is alarming, and yet with all the negative possibilities, they're promoted, advertised, and often praised. Maybe they're amazing, maybe they're not, but the manufacturers have no plans to slow down productions and sales. Now, obviously the situation was different since they couldn't pinpoint the cause of the poison and people were dying. But for Johnson & Johnson to actually put out advertising against their own product, it seemed like financial suicide. Yet, they were praised for their response to the crisis. Their honesty through public relations was something rarely seen. They demonstrated how a major business could properly handle a devastating disaster. And within a few years, they once again held the highest market share for over-the-counter analgesics in the United States. The investigation led to the conclusion that the bottles had been tampered with after they had already been placed on shelves, not during production. They hypothesized that someone took them from the shelves, added potassium cyanide through the gelatin capsule, and returned them to be purchased and consumed by unknowing customers. Now, if someone had been trying to buy Tylenol and return it all over town, someone would have noticed and questions would have been asked. So had the person or persons been stealing the bottles, then casually placing them back into the locations? A man named James William Lewis sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson claiming responsibility for the deaths and demanding $1 million to stop. He lived in New York City, and the police couldn't connect him to the crimes. He was, however, charged with extortion and spent some time in prison. A bar owner named Marty Sinclair reported that one of his patrons could be the suspect. Roger Arnold frequented the bar and had made comments that led Sinclair to believe that he was guilty of the crimes. When the police searched Arnold's house, they found a book called The Poor Man's James Bond, which contained instructions for making potassium cyanide. But they didn't find anything linking him to the actual crime. After the investigation, Arnold waited with a gun in hand for Sinclair. When he stepped out, he shot and killed him. Only it wasn't Sinclair. It was a random innocent man. So both possible suspects ended up in prison, but neither for the crimes the police were originally investigating. With no one in custody, who's to say that the crisis had ended? Over the next few years, hundreds of copycats emerged involving over-the-counter medications. Perhaps all the perpetrators were hoping that the original individual would take the blame for another crime committed. I'm sure to them it seemed like a good plan, but instead, many of those murders were solved, and quite a few scorned lovers ended up in prison. When Tylenol Extra Strength was finally reintroduced to the market, it was triple sealed to prevent tampering. A terrifying string of events led to reforms in packaging of over-the-counter drugs and federal anti-tampering laws. In 1983, it was made a federal offense to tamper with products meant for consumption. In 1989, new guidelines for packaging of products meant for consumption were put into place. In 1991, Johnson & Johnson reached an undisclosed sum to be paid out to the families of the individuals that died in Chicago. The agreement was not the business taking responsibility for the deaths, but rather wanting to help the families and encouraging everyone to put the terrible events behind them. In 2010, with new DNA testing methods available, they once again tested the DNA from Arnold and Lewis against the DNA found on the Tylenol bottles. They were not a match. Not only was it disappointing that they didn't match, but if the person that committed the crime had ever been convicted of another crime, their DNA should be in the system. So to have the DNA on the bottles, but never being able to link it to a person, is a mystery in itself. Did the individual never commit another crime, or did they become more careful with their methods to not leave any evidence behind? And it leaves the big question, what was the motive behind the Chicago murders? Was there an intended victim and all the other casualties were just unfortunate mishaps? There's still not a definite answer. Although it does raise other questions. How many items are in our cabinets, pantries, and refrigerators that could have been tampered with without us even knowing? They never did charge anyone with the crimes. When we think about what it takes to get a product from production to market, there could be endless possibilities. The product starts in a facility, goes through a warehouse and packaging, and gets shipped and delivered, then stocked and picked up and put down by consumers until finally purchased and handed to a cashier. It makes you stop and think that our society must be extremely trusting in people when we think about the amount of hands that have contact with any given product. Maybe we should just hope that most people are good and honest, because it seems that the hands that caused the Chicago Tylenol murders just wanted to spark chaos and watch it burn. That's 10 Minute Murder for today. brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe. I'm the host of this podcast, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. And stop right now what you're doing for a moment. Take a look at where you're listening to this podcast. Are you subscribed? If you're a brand new listener to 10 Minute Murder, that's cool. Make sure you do that now so that you don't miss any future episodes of 10 Minute Murder, and it makes it easier to go back and listen to previous episodes of 10 Minute Murder. Now, if you're an OG listener of this podcast and you're not subscribed, I don't know what to tell you. I hate telling people that they're doing things wrong, but you're doing things wrong. Instead of searching for the podcast every time you want to listen to it, if you hit subscribe right now, it'll always be there. Now, some of the apps that you listen in don't always make it easy to find the subscribe button. I'll give you that, because it doesn't always say subscribe for some reason. It might say collect or follow or any number of things, but something that kind of means subscribe, push that button. And if you've been listening for a long time and you're already subscribed, I will love you for the rest of my life. The end. And quickly, let me talk about something that was on my mind during the majority of me telling that story just now. What keeps us normal human beings from doing bad things to other human beings? Because most of us don't necessarily, cause harm to other people intentionally on a day-to-day basis. But why? What keeps us from doing that? For some of us, it's religion. For others, it's just because it's bad karma. For me personally, I think I just feel empathetic when it comes to other people. Even if you're a piece of trash, I feel bad that you're a piece of trash. And there is a religious element in there for me, and there's also a karma element for me. And that's where I'm getting to when I'm talking about what was going through my head this entire story that I was telling it. And it's one line from a song. I was singing the whole song in my head, but one line of it is the reason. Karma is a relaxing thought. And yes, that's a Taylor Swift song, but karma is a relaxing thought. Because if you believe that karma is a real thing and you actively try to be a decent person, then karma is a relaxing thought. You don't have to get even with other people. You don't have to go out of your way to ruin someone's day because they harmed you in some way. Karma is a relaxing thought. Okay, now that I'm quoting Taylor Swift, I think it's probably time to end this episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10 Minute Murder.